In the mansion's kitchen, the stepmother's voice thundered like a whip. She pointed furiously at the girl, forcing her to lower her gaze. But in that instant, something changed. The driver, with an impeccable uniform and firm expression, stepped between them, protecting the little one with unexpected determination. The tension left the air in silence, and what was about to be revealed would not only question loyalty, but also the true meaning of justice in a family. What city are you watching this video from, and what time is it? By the way, if you're enjoying my videos, I'd be so happy if you could subscribe to my channel and like this video. And before we continue, let me wish you health and peace. Tell me, from which country and at what time are you watching this story? In an elegant mansion in Boston's Beacon Hill neighborhood, a 9-year-old girl scrubs the floor with an old rag, while outside, Boston prepares for Independence Day celebrations. The laughter of neighbors celebrating contrasts with the cold silence inside the house. A foreboding of the injustice Lucia lives every day. Lucia knelt on the marble floor with aching knees and hands cracked from soapy water. Her school dress, already too short for her age, stuck to her damp skin. Her brown hair, hastily pulled back with a worn ribbon, escaped in rebellious strands that fell over her sweaty forehead. Her small figure seemed even more fragile in that immense living room, where every piece of furniture gleamed under the light of a chandelier. But she, crouched on the floor, seemed invisible. Carmen, her stepmother, paced back and forth with her phone in hand. She wore elegant, fitted clothing and left behind a strong scent of expensive perfume. Her voice, sharp and dry, occasionally broke the silence. "Faster, Lucia. This looks like a stable," she ordered, without even looking at her. The girl pressed the rag against the floor, obedient, not daring to protest. Each movement was heavy, not only from exhaustion, but from fear. She knew any response could cost her dinner, as had happened so many times before. The phone rang. Carmen changed her expression in an instant, transforming her tone into sweet and friendly. "Alexander, darling. Everything's perfect here. Yes, Lucia eats very well. She even helps me in the kitchen. Don't worry about anything. You focus on your business." Lucia listened to every word while scrubbing the floor, feeling a knot tighten in her throat. The night before, she had barely eaten a piece of hard bread with watered-down milk because she didn't finish her chores on time. She wanted to scream that it was all a lie, but she remained silent, certain that nobody would listen to her. Alexander Herrera, her father, was in Los Angeles closing contracts with California businessmen. A successful man, accustomed to luxury, hotels and endless dinners, he had delegated his daughter's care to Carmen, naively thinking that with her in charge, Lucia would be safe. That blind trust kept him calm during his trips, but at the same time distanced him from the girl's real suffering. Upon finishing rinsing the rag, Lucia allowed herself a breath by the hallway window. Outside, Boston overflowed with life. American flags hung from balconies, red, white, and blue decorations adorned the storefronts, and the aroma of hot dogs and freshly baked apple pies mixed with the bustle of children running with balloons. Lucia pressed her forehead against the cold glass, wishing to be there, even if just for an instant. The illusion vanished with Carmen's voice. "If you don't finish before dinner, you won't eat," she told her as she passed by, like an inevitable sentence. Lucia returned to the floor with contained tears. She pressed her lips together and scrubbed, harder, as if with that gesture she could erase the sadness consuming her. In the house reigned a heavy silence, barely interrupted by Carmen's footsteps and the distant murmur of the city celebrating. She didn't know that from the hallway someone else was watching her attentively. Tired eyes, accustomed to keeping silent, followed her every movement, as if waiting for the right moment to intervene. Lucia presses her lips together and continues scrubbing, not knowing that someone else is watching her from the hallway. The next day, the mansion's garage became an unexpected refuge for Lucia. The space smelled of gasoline and metal, mixed with the light scent of summer flowers sold on the nearby corner. The first rays of sun filtered through a crack, illuminating the dust motes floating in the air. Mr. Ernesto, in his blue work overalls with his shirt sleeves rolled up, checked the engine of the black car that had been in the Herrera family's service for over 2 decades. Lucia appeared dragging a bucket full of water. The metal handle bit into her fingers, and drops fell onto the cold floor, leaving traces of her effort. Her dress, too short for her age, was damp at the bottom, and her worn shoes sank into the puddles. She tried not to make noise, but each step seemed a reminder of the burden she carried. Ernesto lifted his head and observed her in silence. He had seen that girl grow up since she was a baby, though always from a distance. He had never intervened in family matters, conscious of his place as driver and worker. However, that morning he noticed in Lucia's eyes a different exhaustion. An exhaustion that didn't correspond to a 9-year-old girl. He approached slowly, took out a package from his jacket and extended it toward her. "Take this," he said in a low voice. Lucia looked at him with suspicion. Inside the wax paper, still warm, hid a freshly bought donut from a shop near Faneuil Hall on his way to work. The sweet aroma mixed with the heavy garage air. "Thank you, Mr. Ernesto," she stammered. "But if Carmen sees me, eat, child. Nobody should work on an empty stomach," he responded with paternal firmness. Lucia hesitated, but hunger defeated fear. She took a timid bite, and immediately the sugar crunched between her teeth. A brief smile, almost imperceptible, drew itself on her face. Ernesto, who rarely showed emotions, felt a lump in his throat. He took out a wrinkled handkerchief from his pocket and offered it to her. "I miss Mom," Lucia whispered, as if the words escaped without wanting to. "Dad barely looks at me anymore." Ernesto remained motionless. The keys in his hand stopped moving, and for an instant he seemed to return in time to his own past. He crouched down to the girl's height, his knees creaking from years of work. "You're not alone, Lucia. Perhaps I can't change everything, but while I'm here, nobody will hurt you." The girl broke into silent tears, hiding her face against her knees. Ernesto placed his hand on her hair, caressing it slowly, like a grandfather trying to repair years of abandonment with a simple gesture. In his tired eyes shone a promise. He would no longer allow more injustices. Upstairs on the 2nd floor, a curtain moved discreetly. Carmen observed from the window, her face showing an icy smile, satisfied at having discovered a bond she wouldn't tolerate. She couldn't stand the idea of Lucia finding comfort in anyone, much less in a house employee. She lowered the curtain with a sharp pull and walked away, planning how to cut that complicity at the root. Meanwhile, the garage filled with small, everyday sounds. The tick-tock of a clock hanging on the wall, the dripping of water from the bucket, and the distant ringing of church bells. Lucia, with still moist eyes, allowed herself to smile timidly as she finished the donut. It was the first time in weeks she felt warmth in her heart. Ernesto returned to his work, but with the certainty that something had changed. That fragile girl had remembered what dignity and innocence meant. And in silence, he swore to himself that whatever happened, he would no longer remain quiet. From the upper floor window, Carmen watches them with an icy smile. The house dressed in luxury that afternoon. Carmen had ordered all the lamps in the main living room turned on, the floors polished until they shone like mirrors, and the vases filled with fresh flowers. The antique paintings seemed more solemn than ever, and in a display case gleamed until that morning, the porcelain fan inherited from past generations, the pride of the Herrera family. Outside, Boston continued bathed in the golden light of sunset. In the square street, musicians played guitars, balconies displayed colorful bunting, and the city's bustle contrasted with the forced calm inside the mansion. Lucia, in a dress too large that almost dragged on the floor, carried a tray of crystal glasses. She walked slowly, fearing she would trip. The weight of the tray made her lean, and each step was an ordeal. Carmen watched her closely with narrowed eyes, feigning a smile when guests were near. "More careful, girl. Don't ruin the evening," she whispered through her teeth with a venomous tone. Lucia obeyed in silence, placing the tray on the living room's low table. Her breathing was agitated and her hands trembled, but she forced herself to stay firm. Alexander had returned that same afternoon from a business trip to Miami. He arrived with a tired expression, still with his briefcase in hand, and was received by Carmen with exaggerated kisses. He smiled mechanically, without noticing the tension hidden behind his house's walls. For a few minutes, everything seemed to proceed normally. The guests talked about business, about the Independence Day celebrations that would soon begin, about baseball games and summer concerts in the park. Carmen moved among them as the perfect hostess while Lucia collected plates and napkins, invisible to almost everyone. Ernesto, however, remained near the door, attentive, watching Carmen's gestures with suspicion. There was something in the woman's gaze he didn't like. Suddenly, a theatrical scream broke the calm. "The fan! Where's the fan?" Carmen exclaimed, bringing her hands to her chest. Everyone turned toward the display case. The object that had always been there was not visible. Carmen feigned surprise and anguish, but her eyes shone with a spark of triumph. "It can't be. It was the most valuable thing in Alexander's family, and it's disappeared." Alexander frowned. "What do you mean it's disappeared?" "It must have been her," Carmen said, pointing at Lucia with an accusatory finger. "Always disobedient, always snooping where she shouldn't." Lucia opened her eyes wide. She felt her heart pounding violently in her chest. "I haven't touched anything, Dad. I swear," she murmured with a broken voice. The guests shifted uncomfortably, murmuring among themselves. Some tried to calm the situation, but Carmen insisted, her voice rising like a whip. "It was her. She's always been a problem. What more proof do you need?" Alexander looked at his daughter with confusion. For an instant, doubt settled in his eyes. He wanted to believe her, but his wife's words sounded firm, full of authority. Lucia took a step back, trembling like a cornered little bird. From the door, Ernesto clenched his fist tightly. He had endured too much. He had remained silent too long. He knew Carmen was lying because he himself had seen her that morning open her bedroom closet and store something inside. His blood boiled, but he waited, lips pressed together, for the right moment to speak. The entire living room fell silent. Alexander approached Lucia, looking at her fixedly, with the invisible fan weighing between them like a trial by fire. His breathing became labored. So did his daughter's. Lucia pressed her hands against her dress, feeling the world crumbling. Ernesto, at the door, closed his fist tighter, determined to intervene even if it cost him everything. Alexander stares fixedly at his daughter, doubting, while Ernesto clenches his fist, ready to speak. In the main living room, one could hear even the creaking of wood under Alexander's feet. The tension was so dense the air seemed not to circulate. Lucia, with reddened eyes, shrank into a corner trying to convince herself this was all a nightmare. Carmen maintained the composure of a consummate actress, hands on her chest, lips trembling as if mortally wounded by the fan's disappearance. But behind that mask was an invisible smile, the satisfaction of seeing the girl cornered. Mr. Ernesto, standing near the door, shifted restlessly. He wasn't a man of words, accustomed to silence and obedience, but that scene stuck in him like a thorn. For years he had worked in that house, seeing minor injustices, but now everything had gone too far. He looked at Lucia, trembling, and suddenly remembered his own daughter, when as a child she cried over something she hadn't done. The memory hit him hard, and in that instant he knew he couldn't remain silent. "Enough, Mr. Alexander," he said with a grave voice, interrupting Carmen. The echo of his words resonated in the living room. Alexander turned, surprised. Rarely did Ernesto speak with such authority. Carmen looked at him with disdain. "And what do you know, old driver? Stick to your keys and your wheels, not what happens in my house." "With due respect, ma'am," Ernesto replied without raising his voice. "I saw who stored the fan. It wasn't the girl." A murmur ran through the guests. Alexander opened his eyes with disbelief. "What are you saying, Ernesto?" "I'm saying the truth, sir. I saw Mrs. Carmen open her bedroom closet and store the fan there this very morning." Carmen's face paled for an instant, but she immediately recovered her mask. "Lies! Are you going to believe an old servant before your wife? What a great offense." Alexander hesitated. He looked at his daughter, who watched him with her heart in her throat, waiting for a gesture. Then he looked at Ernesto, who held him with a firm gaze, without a trace of doubt. "Let's open the closet," Alexander finally said in a low voice, but charged with tension. Carmen stepped back. "That's disrespectful. You can't ask me." "Let's open the closet," he repeated, this time more firmly. Those present held their breath. Ernesto walked alongside Alexander to the hallway. Carmen, pressured by the gazes, had to follow them. Upon reaching the bedroom, Alexander extended his hand. "The keys, Carmen." The woman hesitated, pretended to search in her purse, and finally handed over a small set of keys. Alexander opened the closet. The silence was absolute until at the back of a shelf gleamed the porcelain fan, intact, beautiful, with the colors that had passed from generation to generation. Lucia, who had followed from a distance, brought her hands to her mouth. A tear rolled down her cheek, a mixture of relief and fear. Alexander stood frozen with the fan in his hands. His gaze slowly shifted toward Carmen. She tried to speak, stammered excuses, said perhaps the girl had hidden it there playing, that she didn't remember anything, but her voice no longer sounded convincing even to herself. The guests began to murmur among themselves, uncomfortable with the spectacle. Ernesto, without taking his eyes off Alexander, took a step forward. "In this house I've seen everything," he said. "But I'll never let an innocent girl bear a guilt that isn't hers." The phrase fell like a hammer blow. Alexander felt the earth open beneath his feet. He looked again at his daughter, fragile, with still moist eyes, and for the first time in a long while felt he had failed as a father. Alexander demands Carmen open the closet. "The fan appears there." Lucia looks at her father with moist eyes, asking silently, "Now will you believe me?" The fan rested on the table like an uncomfortable witness, illuminated by the chandelier. None of those present seemed to dare breathe. Alexander stood with his hands resting on the surface as if he needed to hold on to keep from falling. He had traveled hundreds of miles in search of contracts and agreements, but now, before that fragile porcelain object, he felt his entire world swaying. Carmen tried to regain control. "Alexander, you have to understand. Perhaps it was a mistake. Perhaps someone else put it there without my noticing." "A mistake," he repeated with disbelief. "How can it appear in your closet by mistake?" The guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, and some began to discreetly withdraw from the living room, murmuring excuses. Nobody wanted to be present at that scandal. Ernesto remained standing, firm like a statue. He had fulfilled his duty, but knew the weight of the final decision fell on Alexander. Lucia, seated on the edge of a chair, had her hands pressed on her lap. She looked at her father with a mixture of fear and hope. Each second of silence was martyrdom, each of her glances toward Carmen, torture. Alexander walked slowly toward his wife. His voice came out broken, charged with pain. "How could you? For months I trusted you. I left my daughter in your hands thinking you would be caring for her. And this is how you repay me." "Don't exaggerate," Carmen shouted, losing her mask. "That girl has always been a burden. I was just trying to put order in this house. You were never here. Someone had to do it." Those words were like a knife in Alexander's chest. Suddenly he understood the magnitude of his blindness. He had worked day and night to secure a future, but had neglected the only thing that really mattered: his daughter. Ernesto, with a serene voice, intervened. "Family divides when truth is forgotten. There's no fortune that compensates for the damage of injustice." Alexander closed his eyes. He could still hear the echo of the city. A college a cappella group sang in the street, harmonies that intoned songs of love and friendship. The cheerful and distant music contrasted with the sadness weighing in the living room. He opened his eyes and turned toward Lucia. He knelt before her, took her small hands in his, and whispered with a trembling voice, "Forgive me, daughter. Forgive me for not protecting you before." Lucia remained motionless for an instant, surprised. Then, as if an invisible barrier broke, she threw herself to hug her father with all her strength. Both their tears mixed, and the entire living room filled with an emotion nobody could ignore. Carmen took a step back with a distorted face. Her eyes darkened, incapable of accepting that defeat. "This doesn't end here," she said in a low voice, but charged with venom. "I won't allow a brat and a driver to ruin what belongs to me." Alexander stood up and looked at her firmly. For the first time, his words were a wall. "Enough, Carmen. You no longer have power in this house." She observed him with contained fury, like a cornered animal, and left the living room, slamming the door. The vibration of the closing door made the window panes tremble. The subsequent silence was profound. Ernesto approached slowly, placed a hand on Alexander's shoulder, and nodded without need for words. It had been a hard road, but finally the right step had been taken. The fan remained on the table, gleaming under the light, now converted into a symbol of a broken lie and a recovered truth. Outside, the a cappella group continued its song, reminding that Boston, with all its life and bustle, moved forward. But inside that house, something had changed forever. A father had found his daughter again. Carmen, with a distorted face, promises revenge. This doesn't end here. The following morning dawned different in the mansion. The spring light entered through the dining room windows and slid over the main table, which had never before seemed so welcoming. Lucia, for the first time in a long while, sat next to her father for breakfast. The aroma of toasted bread and freshly brewed coffee filled the air. On her plate was a glass of warm milk and a generous portion of donuts that Ernesto had brought early, still wrapped in wax paper. Alexander, with a renewed expression, cut a slice of bread while observing his daughter. He had slept little, tormented by the conscience of all that had occurred, but that morning he had risen with a clear decision. Nothing would be as before. He looked at Lucia and with a firm but gentle voice declared, "From today on, nobody will treat you unjustly again. This house will be your refuge, not your punishment." Lucia looked up and her eyes lit with a timid gleam of hope. Ernesto, seated discreetly to one side, smiled satisfied. In silence, he took a sip of his coffee, happy to see the girl eat without fear. Carmen entered suddenly with a pale face and tense lips. She wore wrinkled clothes as if the entire night she had been plotting her next move. She planted herself in front of the table and tried to recover authority. "Alexander, you can't let this girl dictate the rules. Not after everything we've built together." Alexander interrupted her calmly, but firmly. "What's built on lies doesn't deserve to be defended. I've been blind too long, Carmen. Today I choose my daughter." The blow of those words resonated louder than any shout. Carmen trembled as if the carpet under her feet were crumbling. She tried to reply, but her voice broke. Alexander stood up, looked at her directly, and added, "If you're not capable of respecting Lucia, there's no place for you here." The woman pressed her lips together, grabbed her purse with a brusque gesture, and left the dining room, leaving behind a silence charged with liberation. Lucia breathed deeply, as if finally removing an invisible weight from herself. She turned toward Ernesto, who winked at her with complicity. They finished breakfast together, without hurry, enjoying a peace that until that moment seemed impossible. Later, Ernesto took Lucia to school in the old black car. She, from the back seat, observed the streets full of festive posters, the balconies decorated with American flags, and the vendors offering flowers on every corner. Boston was preparing for the Independence Day parade, and the city's bustle seemed like a hymn to hope. Upon arriving, Lucia hesitated for an instant before getting out. She looked at Ernesto, took his hand tightly, and whispered, "Thank you for believing in me." The man felt the words pierce his soul. He nodded silently, knowing he had done the right thing. Alexander, who had accompanied them to the school door, observed that scene with a lump in his throat. For the first time in a long while, he silently promised himself he would never again leave his daughter alone. The Independence Day parade advanced through the streets with music, laughter, and bells. And while the city celebrated, in the heart of the Herrera family began a new stage, built not on appearances, but on truth, justice, and true love. Alexander, seeing them together, silently promises he will never fail as a father again. The image of Lucia smiling next to her father, after so many contained tears, remains engraved like the last breath of this story. It's not only about a happy ending in appearance, but the beginning of a new life in which truth finally found space. And perhaps, dear listeners, in some corner of your memory, that simple question also appears. What does it truly mean to protect our loved ones? If this story has moved you, leave a 1 in the comments. If you think it could be told differently or feel something was missing, write a 0, because beyond the luxury of a mansion in Beacon Hill, the contracts in Los Angeles, or the endless trips, what really sustained this family's heart was a small gesture, that of a humble driver who decided not to remain silent, and that of a father who had the courage to ask his daughter for forgiveness. Life teaches us again and again that love and kindness can tear down the hardest walls. The lesson is there. It's not blood or fortune that makes us family, but the daily decision to care for one another. And that decision, when truly made, transforms destinies. Perhaps some of you remember a moment when you also made a mistake, when routine, work, or pride blinded you to what was essential. We've all felt that weight, but there always exists the possibility to rectify. Like Alexander, we can recognize our errors and open our arms to those waiting for our protection. Like Ernesto, we can extend our hand even when we believe we have nothing to offer. In the end, A sincere gesture is enough to illuminate the darkness. The heart of this story beats with a simple certainty. Kindness isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. Everyone deserves love. Everyone deserves a home. And like a lamp that lights up in the window during the night, even the smallest spark of affection can guide us on life's darkest paths. That light, though humble, never goes out as long as there's someone willing to light it for others. I invite you, friends, to stop for an instant and think about your own life. To whom do you owe a word of forgiveness? To whom can you give a gesture of support, even if it's small? Don't let the opportunity pass, because sometimes happiness doesn't arrive with great events, but with those details that seem insignificant and yet change everything. If this story has touched your heart, share it with someone you love. Perhaps it will remind them they're not alone. And if you feel it deserves more space in your life, I encourage you to join this corner where we tell stories that connect us and restore our hope. In the end, we all seek the same thing: a home where truth, justice, and love embrace us without conditions.